The city of Königgrätz, shown here as it appeared in 1866, still has a city center and a town square looking as they did then and for centuries before. With its 14th century cathedral, the town hall, and the main town square. And there's the town hall with the coat of arms of the old Czechoslovakia on display. And the rest of the square. The Jesuit college right there has today been turned into a hotel. There's a restaurant next to it, as well as office space. But in 1866, the commandant of the fortress had to look nervously at what was going on out in that direction to the northwest along the main road to Gitchen, or Jitchen, where the biggest battle of the 19th century would soon be fought. Today at Chlum, there's an observation tower giving a good view of the entire battlefield, and a nice small museum with, among other things, a diorama showing the entire area of combat here. Benedek would have given his field marshal's baton for this view from the observation tower at today's Chlum. The village of Chlum itself, with its church steeple right there, here on the heights, was a landmark visible from afar. The main road running northwest from Königgrätz in that direction, and the fortress and the city of Königgrätz down there to the southeast. Much smaller, of course, then than now. Benedek's headquarters here at Lipa, toward the crest of these heights of Chlum, at the center of his entire position, something like 220,000 Imperial Austrian troops, all of which could be seen from this high up. Out there to the west, campfires perhaps visible in the pre-dawn darkness, and then troops visible after the sun came up. The Prussians, the Prussian First Army, coming this direction from the west and the northwest. Below these heights, beyond the Bistritz stream. Perhaps even more crucially, Benedek could have had people looking to the north in that direction. When would the Crown Prince with the Prussian Second Army appear? That was the great unknown of this day of battle. If he came from that direction, he would have to pass over the heights of Masloved, the village of Masloved that you can see there. And he would have to pass around that forest over there, the Sveepwald. A patch of forest that would play a crucial role in this day's battle. He could certainly have seen his own army in its dispositions along this whole front. Here in the center, 44,000 men and 134 cannon to hold these heights against frontal attacks by the First Army. The Third Corps of Archduke Ernst of Austria held these heights to the north of the highway, to the north of Lipa. To the left, the 10th Corps of Ludwig von Gablentz, the veterans of Trautenau and Sur, with forward units down there as far as the river, but again, the river would not be held. The heights definitely would be. Down there, the left wing of the entire army, 40,000 men, 140 cannons. The Saxon army under its crown prince, the strongest force down there, and along with them, the Austrian 8th Corps, the vanquished of Skalitz. The hapless Archduke Leopold was gone into some kind of honorable retirement. Major General von Weber now commanded those troops. And the right wing of this front line, the people who would have to guard against the Crown Prince's army whenever it showed up. The 4th Corps under Count Festatich, 2nd Corps under Karl Count von Thun-Hohenstadt, Count Thun for short. A total of 55,000 men, 176 cannon. They had been ordered to take position in a line of earthworks already prepared for them, facing north. To the rear, in formation on either side of that main highway to Königgrätz, an enormously strong reserve. The 1st Corps of Count Clam-Gallas, now commanded by a General Gondrecourt, and Baron Ramming's hard-fighting 6th Corps. Along with them, 3 full divisions of heavy cavalry and a huge artillery reserve, 320 guns. A total of 47,000 infantry, 11,000 cavalry, and again, 320 cannon. That huge reserve could be used for several things. If there were some kind of a breakthrough or a catastrophe on a flank, they could move to block it. More importantly, if there were success here on the front, if the Prussian First Army could be held and battered by the Austrian artillery and by this strong line along the heights, then that huge reserve could be thrown into a very massive counter blow to shatter that Prussian force. And this would have to be done, though, before the Prussian Second Army showed up. One change in these dispositions took place early in the morning, and it would have a pretty huge impact on the way this battle was to go. That right wing, those 55,000 men and 2 corps facing north, were holding prepared lines in fairly low ground, pretty much along that line of light-colored green field that you see out there. The higher ground was out beyond it, at that village of Masloved and some other heights in that direction. The 2 aristocratic corps commanders were not very strong-willed, it seemed, but the 4th Corps' deputy commander, second in command, definitely was. Major General Anton Molinari was to have a huge effect on the way this battle would be fought. And it was he who felt that rather than stay down there in those fortified lines, low-lying lines, his corps and the 2nd Corps to his right, which had been told to stay in line with him, should pivot, should move forward to occupy the heights of Masloved, and should face not directly north, but northwest and even west towards the Svietwald. Higher ground, better ground, ground aimed at possibly facing the flank of the Prussian First Army. Molinari argued that these positions would be much better ones, both because of the higher terrain and because of the nearer enemy. When the Second Army showed up, he said there would be time to move back, to get those troops back into a position facing directly north, and to deal with that threat when the time came. But for the time being, these 2 corps were facing northwest and west. "7:30 in the morning, July 3rd, 1866, shots were fired, rifle shots, down along the Bistritz River, and then artillery, both from the Prussian guns down there and the massive artillery reply from these guns up here on the heights of Chlum. The Battle of Königgrätz had begun. This high ground overlooking the village of Dub over there was to be the Prussian First Army headquarters throughout the battle. And the King and Bismarck and Moltke were to join Prince Frederick Charles at this location. The Prussian soldiers had been up well before dawn. Their divisions had been moving into line and were mostly in place by 6 o'clock in the morning. Looking eastward over the Bistritz River at the Austrian positions. You can see there in the distance today the observation tower at Chlum. In 1866, the landmark there was the church tower, much lower, but still clearly visible without that belt of 20th century trees. Major von Unger, the staff officer who had spotted the Austrian army here the day before, was riding with Prince Frederick Charles's staff. And as they approached this hill, the prince said, "I hope they haven't withdrawn." About 6 o'clock, as they came up to this spot, any doubts were put to rest. The Austrian army was there, and the prince shook Major Unger's hand warmly. Both the prince and his chief of staff later claimed that they were not in any way intimidated by what they saw, but the Austrian lines were very imposing. There were journalists from the London Times attached to both armies, as well as one of them back in the town of Königgrätz, trying to watch everything from the tower in the town. But the war correspondent here at the headquarters of 1st Army left a good description of this scene. "A person standing this morning on top of the ridge saw Sadowa down below him, barely visible here, down there in the Bistritz Valley. Wooden cottages surrounded by orchards, but all the inhabitants of the village had been sent away, and the white coats seen here and there among the cottages were not peasants' blouses, but were the uniforms of Austrian soldiers. On the open slope behind Dohlitz, there seemed to run a dark dotted line of stumpy bushes, but the telescope showed that these were guns, and that this battery alone contained 12 pieces. There were a great many more than just a single battery of 12 guns in position, facing this way on that high ground. Directly in front, then, the heights of Chlum, the center of the Austrian line. The Army of the Elbe would have to attack down on that flank, crossing the Bistritz and making its way up through Prim and Problus, where the Saxons and the Austrian 8th Corps were going to defend. No one knew it yet, but that wooded area right there, the Sveepwald, would turn out to be a crucial part of this whole terrain. And many of the staffers here had their telescopes pointed to the north, wondering when the Second Army, the Crown Prince's Second Army, would show up. 8:15, King William and his suite arrived here at Dub. With him was one semi-civilian, the Minister-President of Prussia, Otto von Bismarck. Bismarck was a major in the Landwehr cavalry from years before, and he was wearing his cuirassier's helmet and a long gray coat in uniform along with so many others at this point. With them too, Chief of Staff Helmuth von Moltke. Moltke had a cold this day and was making frequent use of a red silk handkerchief. The flashes of some artillery could be seen as guns opened fire about that time. Bismarck spurred his horse over to Moltke and asked, "Do you know how long this towel is, whose corner we've grabbed here?" "No," said Moltke, "we don't know exactly, only that it is at least 3 corps and perhaps the whole Austrian army." Shortly after 8 o'clock, Moltke, by way of the king, issued orders to Prince Frederick Charles to attack along the entire Bistritz line. Frederick Charles, of course, hoped that he would play the decisive role in this battle, smashing the Austrian center, routing Benedek's army. Moltke firmly believed that the battle would be decided on the flanks. With Herwarth's army on the one hand, Second Army on the other, forming a pincher, the whole function, he thought, of this First Army was simply to attack and pin the enemy in place so that he could not escape the pinchers when they closed. Now at 8:30 in the morning came the first serious commitment of infantry. All along the river from Königgrätz to Benedek, Prussian riflemen moved forward, attacked the bridges over that small stream and the wooded slopes that lay beyond. Between 8:30 and 10 in the morning, 3 Prussian divisions of the First Army forced their way across the Bistritz. The Austrian defenders, as planned, put up a stubborn defense at the river line and then fell back deliberately to those high grounds where their artillery support, where their main line of defense was located. William Russell, the correspondent of the London Times, was watching all this with his telescope from the tower back in Königgrätz. And he wrote, "It looked as if the Prussians had attacked the position almost simultaneously from left to right. For 9 miles and more, the whole range of hills and valleys and slopes was as if the earth had been turned into snow wreaths, agitated in a wintry gale. Before 10 o'clock, a thicker and darker cloud rose from the trees in the village on the right. That was the village of Sadowa over there, burning. Sadowa, Makrovus, Dohalitz were all taken by the Prussians, but then their advance was completely halted by the overwhelming artillery barrage coming down from those Austrian positions on the hills. The Austrian 3rd and 10th Corps had a total of 136 guns up there, reinforced later in the morning from the artillery reserve to 160 cannon, all lined up, ranked in tiers, blasting the troops down in this direction. Those Prussian troops could make no progress. Those Prussian troops had to spend 4 long, desperate hours subjected to this overwhelming barrage. Here in this batch of woods, the Hola Wald, not particularly thick or dense. Many of the Prussian units were pinned down. Neither the Hola Wald nor the nearby villages offered much cover. The Austrian gunners had calibrated with some accuracy the distance out here. The Prussian troops in these woods muttered and cursed. "The dogs, they're using measured ranges." Indeed they were. "We looked for cover," one soldier later wrote, "but where was one to find it in this kind of fire? We withdrew to the left into the woods, but it was no better there. Jagged hunks of wood and big tree splinters flew around our heads. At last a kind of apathy came over us. We pulled out our watches and kept count. I was standing by the flag. Inside of 10 seconds, 4 bombshells and 1 shrapnel shell exploded right in front of us. When shrapnel explodes in the air, it rattles down on the ground like hailstones, and in the sky a beautiful smoke ring rises, getting bigger all the time until it disappears. I saw all that. We all felt we were in God's hands. This unending barrage, well, it seemed to be unending. It went on for 4 long hours. Sometimes Prussian units almost desperately tried to make counterattacks up against those heights, spontaneous at small unit levels. Those came to nothing, of course. Other times, troops with torn uniforms and bleeding wounds stumbled back out of the woods to the rear. Their officers, of course, had to try to keep all these formations under control. The Prussian had their artillery, but they were not that effective. By noon, there were 17 Prussian batteries in action, replying to those Austrian guns, but many of these were smoothbore 12-pounders, in no way as good or as accurate as the rifled Austrian cannon, expertly handled by the gunners on those slopes. By noon, the casualties here in the wood and along this whole line, the Prussian casualties, were very heavy. And as far as anyone could tell, all this expenditure of Prussian blood had not made the slightest impression on the Austrian lines. If this kept on much longer, morale among all these troops would disintegrate. If that were to happen, a really massive Austrian attack with that huge reserve of troops, 40,000 of them, kept back behind the Austrian lines, might crush the Prussian First Army. 4 years in the future, in France, something very similar to that would indeed happen. At Gravelotte, for hours, the Prussians were pinned down by deadly French fire. Late in that day, Prussian morale did crack, a rout did develop. Thousands of Prussian troops did indeed stream to the rear, past their king and their army commanders in panic-stricken rout. The situation here was similar, except that at Gravelotte, the French did not make a massive counterattack. They had no intention of doing that, and so the rout had no long-term consequences. In this case, if Benedek were to launch those 40,000 troops in a really massive blow, he could win his battle. Here at the southern end of the entire Austrian line, the Saxon army and the Austrian 8th Corps were doing rather well through most of the morning and into the early afternoon. The Saxons had done their controlled withdrawal from the bridgehead down at Königgrätz over the Bistritz, and had fallen back here to their strong positions. Down there, just behind those trees, is the little village of Neuprim. Up there is Oberprim, and here Niederprim, with behind it the very high ground of Problus, prominent hill position right back there. Strong positions, good Saxon troops, and a rather unaggressive Prussian commander. The army of the Elbe, troops from the Rhineland mainly, commanded by General Herwarth von Bittenfeld, was cautious, was not anxious to stick his head out if there were a major crisis in the Prussian center to his left, was anxious to get more reserves allocated to him before he launched a really vigorous attack. He did not launch such an attack all morning. If he had, it would have come through these fields from that direction from the west. Prince Albert of Saxony, commanding this entire wing of the army, decided to mount a counterattack in that direction to secure his ground even more. About 1:30 in the afternoon, his 2nd Brigade marched down from the Three Prims in this direction through these fields, heading for their Prussian opponents in that direction. Their left was guarded by the Austrian 8th Corps, aligned on the far edge of that wood that you see there, the Steserek wood. These 8th Corps troops were the survivors of Skalitz. Their Habsburg commander had been replaced by another, perhaps slightly better Habsburg, Archduke Ernest. But the troops in those brigades that had been battered so severely at Skalitz might have problems if they were hit again. They would be hit again. By 1 o'clock, Herwarth had gotten 2 of his 3 Army of the Elbe divisions across the river and in position, and he did then launch a cautious and limited attack against the Austrian flank. He hit the Austrian line down there just beyond that tree line at the far edge of those woods, and the Austrians immediately collapsed. They seem to have been really traumatized by the battle at Skalitz a week earlier. Panic broke out among the Czech battalions of Regiment Nobili as they found themselves once again being shot at by the Prussian needle guns. They broke and fled. Regiment Gerstner, half of Brigade Schultz, all these components of the Austrian 8th Corps panicked and fled, their officers unable to control them. They poured through these woods, through the edge of these woods, out here into this area, right where the Saxons were advancing. And this fleeing mob of thousands of Austrian troops crashed into the Saxon lines from their left. The Saxons, faced by this catastrophe, did the best they could. Their troops kept their formation. They opened ranks to let the fleeing Austrian fugitives pass on through, and then closed up again, opened fire on the Prussian troops advancing through these fields in this direction, holding their own, halting the Prussians for a while, and then falling back through the 3 prims towards their highest ground at the village of Problus in that direction. But clearly, at long last, Herwarth's Prussian troops on this flank were on the advance, slowly perhaps, but still, now, steadily. The Austrian left flank was crumbling. Here at the hilltop village of Problus, with its prominent church, Prince Albert knew that he couldn't hold very long. He would certainly be outflanked. He would have to retreat. By this time, too, about 3 in the afternoon, he was fully aware of the catastrophe that had happened to his right, to the main Austrian force. So once again, a rearguard action here would have to be done, and then a withdrawal. The Saxons fought effectively. Prince Albert praised them. The final elements of the rearguard, he said, should be given the honor of protecting his headquarters as they retreated. That honor would at least keep them out of the worst of the combat. Shortly after 3 o'clock, Problus was in Prussian hands. Herwarth could have advanced more aggressively, could have pursued vigorously, but he did not do so. He still had his 3rd Division, the 16th, yet to cross the Bistritz. They were just beginning to do so by 2:30. His forward divisions at this point were exhausted, had taken a lot of casualties by Prussian standards. With the fall of Problus and a patch of woods behind it, the momentum of this Army of the Elbe slackened and stopped. It would not be General Herwarth who would deliver the final blow to Benedict's army. At the church at Problus, memorials to the fallen are present. This one to the 8th Westphalian Infantry Regiment of the Prussian Army. Again, most of the troops in the Army of the Elbe were from the Rhineland. Austrian 8th Corps units did put up a good fight. The Jaegers were always dependable troops, and they did assist in this controlled withdrawal under Prince Albert's direction. Memorial to the 29th Feldjäger Battalion. And the Saxons have their memorial too. Franz Wilhelm Dahm, captain of the Prince Friedrich August Brigade of the Saxon Army, buried here. And for all the Saxons who fought here, this memorial. Saxony's Brave Sons of the Fatherland, 1866. Individually named, including the privates who died at this spot. And one small memorial to all of the brave fighters who died in the Battle of 3rd July and who are buried here in the cemetery at Problus. All morning then, all but one of those front line Prussian divisions of the First Army were pinned down and battered by that massive artillery barrage. The one exception was the one over in that direction. The 7th Division on the extreme left, the extreme end of the Army's line. Its commander, Edward Friedrich Karl von Fransecky, chose a different role for his troops. And the role that they played would be crucial in determining how the entire battle turned out. Fransecky was not known as a great combat soldier up to this point. He was seen as a kind of an intellectual, had spent most of his career in administrative or teaching roles. He got command of the 7th Division in 1864. Here, however, was to be his first taste in combat. He was turned out to be a very effective commander. Nobody in the Prussian army, no general, understood the basic concept of Moltke's battle plan as well as he did. And both he and Moltke understood the need to keep the enemy pinned down until the Crown Prince's army should arrive on this flank. Before that could happen, though, this 7th Division was going to be involved in what was to be, for both sides, the bloodiest fighting of the entire day. And that would take place here beyond this village of Čistovec, in that belt of woods that you see up there, the Svipwald. That patch of forest, the Svipwald, was about 2,000 yards long, 1,200 yards wide, mingled fir and oak trees. It was older and more thickly planted than the trees of the Hollewald, which provided so little shelter to the troops near the Bistritz. But this patch of woods, hinging the northern flank of the First Army and the spot where the Second Army might soon be appearing, pressed right up against the main Austrian lines at this corner, where the Austrian right wing, 2 Army Corps strong, had the role of guarding against that threat to their flank. If the 7th Division could move into these woods, could seize control of them, they could both secure this flank of the Prussians, link up eventually with the oncoming Second Army, and perhaps threaten the Austrians up there on the hilltops. And so at 8:30 in the morning, Fransecky ordered his men into the Svipwald. Here at the east end of the Svipwald, powerful Austrian forces were already present on those heights overlooking these woods. And they were here because mainly of the efforts of one man, Major General Anton Freiherr von Molinari, was the second in command of the Austrian 4th Corps, the corps up in that sector. The corps commander, Count Festatich, was a rather weak-willed person. He took advice from his second in command, and when Festatich himself was wounded in the foot early in this battle, Molinari took charge of this whole corps. More than that, beyond the 4th Corps was Count Thun's 2nd Corps, who had been given orders simply to stay in touch, to keep his flank in touch with 4th Corps. So one strong-willed major general might determine the actions of two whole corps on this entire flank of the Austrian army. If the army command itself were distracted, which it definitely was. That Austrian right wing, those two corps, had left their prepared positions back behind this row of hills and moved up onto these heights, facing mainly this way, leaving only one detached brigade over on the far right flank to guard against whatever might be coming. But Molinari, as he saw what developed down here, came to have some idea of winning a decisive victory on this flank of the Prussian First Army, of crushing whatever troops might go into this Fiepwald. And then, since that flank was open, and before that possible Prussian Second Army might show up, the troops here might sweep on around the main Prussian army, the First Army, and crush its left. Quite an ambitious idea for a major general. He would, of course, have to convince the army commander, Benedek, eventually to do all this. But that was the vision that Molinari had. That was the idea that inspired him to keep feeding troops into the Fiepwald for a long, bloody day. Franceschi's Prussians burst into these woods at about 8:30 in the morning. That was about the same moment when the rest of the First Army's frontline divisions were moving across the Bistritz into those positions where they would be battered by artillery all the rest of the morning. Here, though, the Prussians stormed in. There were some Austrian troops already here, as well as in the village of Chistovez, just outside the woods. The Prussians also attacked it. After hard fighting, occupied that village, or what was left of it. More Austrian troops fed in. This was to be the course of events all day. And in about the first 1 hour of battle, from 8:30 to 9:30, 6 Prussian battalions had pretty well crippled more than 10 Austrian battalions. The Brigade Brandenstein had been effectively wiped out as a fighting force. Its commander had been killed. This was the kind of fighting throughout the whole morning where higher level commanders had little role to play. It was confused, it was local, the tactical units were quite small. In the end, every man seemed to be fighting by himself. One of the Prussian NCOs agreed, saying it was hardly possible for the officers to hold their columns together. But the rain of shells from Masloved, further on behind the Austrian position, which came down on us, and the boughs and tree splinters that flew at us from all sides, drove us instinctively forward in the sheer hope that by pressing further ahead, we could get out of our critical position. Our higher officers, since there was nothing for them to command, could only influence the men around them by the example of their personal bravery. And this example was not in vain. On both sides, then, losses were heavy. The Prussians won this first round, but the Austrians were just beginning to pour in reinforcements into these woods. At 9:30, 2 more 4th Corps brigades, those of Perk and Fleischhacker, were formed up ready to storm into the woods to clear them and to prepare the way. A barrage of 80 guns from Masloved Heights, firing against the west end of the woods where the Prussians were intended to soften up those defenders. At that same time, Molinari, now in command of 4th Corps, with Festatich wounded, sent a request over to the 2nd Corps commander on his right, Lieutenant Field Marshal Count Thun, asking him for support. And so it would go. Some known, some unknown. Here, rest in God, 40 Austrian and Prussian soldiers. Colonel Perk's brigade, mainly Romanian and Hungarian troops, smashed into the Prussian front and left flank, drove the stubborn Magdeburg troops back to the very far edge of the wood. But then suddenly, on a tree-covered rising on the right flank, masses of Prussians were seen opening a murderous fire from their needle guns. And it was there that that brigade suffered its worst losses. The commander and all of his staff officers except one fell. The other brigade, Brigade Perk, charged in to the rescue and was nearly wiped out. Out of 4,000 men in that brigade, only 1,800 returned from these woods. And there was yet more to come. Count Thun, in charge of the 2nd Corps, had now provided 2 of his brigades to be thrown into the woods, those of General von Safran and the Duke of Württemberg's brigade. Those men again charged in. Franceschi and his men now were very hard pressed. They were suffering massive losses. They were running low or out of ammunition. They felt that they could not hold on much longer. Franceschi sent an aide back requesting reinforcements from the headquarters at 1st Army. Back there, while the king was considering this, Moltke stepped in and said firmly, "I must seriously advise your majesty to send General Franceschi not a single man of infantry support until the Crown Prince has begun his attack, which is the only thing that can bring help to that general. We must be on the lookout for an Austrian offensive. We will beat it off as long as we have our army reserve at our disposal." At least so he felt. In any case, I know General von Franceschi. I know that he will stand firm. And the king agreed. General Franceschi himself was lucky to escape from this battle. Here at this spot, he found himself surrounded by a division of the Austrian 13th Fieldjäger Battalion, but he was rescued by his own infantry, making his way back to the west. In this morning's fighting, Franceschi's 19 battalions had held off and had mostly crippled 50 Austrian battalions. But they themselves had lost 84 of their officers and 2,100 of their men, and the enemy showed no signs of stopping his attacks. Franceschi tried to keep his men's morale up as best he could. "Hold on, Leute, hold on. Stay fest. The Crown Prince is coming. He is coming. Hold on, we've got to stand here or die." The Austrians had another option here in this vault that they never used. After all, this was the end of the First Army's line, the left flank, and Franceschi's division had a wide open flank there to the north, beyond the edge of the woods. Austrian troops, perhaps the 2nd Corps, could have done a flank march around these woods, taking Franceschi from the left flank and from the rear. But this was not the Austrian way. Frontal assaults, vigorously delivered to break the enemy's will, was their style. Plus, a flank march like that would have taken a lot of time, would have taken a lot of good staff work. That was a point that the Austrians were rather weak at. So again, it's something that in theory they could have done. In fact, they did not. Whether they could or not is a good question. the Imperial and Royal Jaeger Battalion Number 8, the Colonel in command, Wilhelm Freiherr von Reitzenstein, 4 lieutenants, 4 senior lieutenants, about 8 second lieutenants, 198 enlisted men, all died in this battle. And they have this memorial. Noon on July 3rd was the high tide of Austrian good fortune. That's the way Gordon Craig describes it. And even as cynical a historian as Geoffrey Vavreau, well aware of all the weaknesses and flaws in the Austrian military system, cannot help but to agree, perhaps grudgingly. If there was any moment of opportunity when a really massive counterattack from those 40,000 and more reserve troops held right back here behind Lipa, when that counterattack could have crushed the Prussian First Army along the Bistritz before the arrival of the Second Army, this was it, noon July 3rd. About 11:30, Benedek, right here at his command post, had gotten a telegram from the fortress over at Josefstadt on the Bistritz, much further north of Königgrätz, telling him that the Crown Prince's army was on its way. But that still left him with an hour and a half, 2 hours, 2.5 hours, something like that time window in which he could launch this massive thunderbolt. People tried to talk him into doing this. From over near the Sweetwald, Count Molinari came galloping in, arguing vehemently to the commander-in-chief that he launched that assault. His own troops had been bleeding heavily in the Sweetwald. He knew about the coming of the Second Army. He knew that it was still more than an hour away. Now was the time to do it. Now was the time to crush the First Army and win the battle. Ludwig von Gablentz, the 10th Corps commander, whose troops guarded the front to our left here, was here at the headquarters as well. He joined in, arguing vehemently. Now was the time to do it. Benedek, however, could not agree, did not agree. It's been said that he was mesmerized by this powerful cannonade. He was a cautious soldier, at least at this level of command, and he saw its position being held, the North Army's position being held cheaply with its guns. Why send his infantry to come to grips with the needle rifle at all? A defensive battle could perhaps be won. For the time being, he was content merely to repulse the Prussians. He did order Molinari and Count Thun to break off their attacks on Franceschi, and then to change front back facing north, returning to their original defensive lines to receive the assault of the Crown Prince's Second Army. That would be much easier said than done. Not until 1 o'clock in the afternoon was the Austrian withdrawal from the Sweetwald underway. And it was a very slow, confused withdrawal. These units have been very badly battered, and in some cases all the officers who could speak the language of their soldiers were dead. There were 59 infantry battalions in those two corps, the 4th and the 2nd, that were guarding this northern flank of the entire army. And of those 59, 46 had been involved in the fighting in the Sweetwald and had suffered accordingly. 3 others had to be thrown in at the very end in order to help bring out the survivors of the battle. And of course they too were badly shot up. That's 49 out of 59. That left 10 intact battalions, mainly in the 2nd Corps. and they were strung very thinly across this front. These troops had to fall back into their defensive lines as best they could. From here, from this village of Masloved, on farther to the east over the high ground north of Chlum. Their positions, of course, were weakly held. These units were disorganized. There were gaps in the line. But this was the force that would now have to receive the attack of the Prussian Second Army coming down from the north.